Good afternoon. Welcome all to the afternoon session of our symposium, and I'm glad to see that it looks like the majority of everybody has stuck around, so that's good. You did have a choice to stay for the afternoon, and we're really happy that you did. But ironically, I was just reading an article about sleep that this is probably well known, but now researchers have documented that the hours between 2 and 4 our circadian rhythms put most of us to sleep. So those of you on this side of the room that didn't notice that there were brownies and other things on that side of the room, you may want to run over and grab something now to keep your energy up so we don't have anybody nodding off. So the whole theme of our last panel is about choice, and I think that there have been a lot of places that we've touched on this topic in the two panels this morning and with the earlier speakers. But choice is an interesting concept, and I think we will explore it more in depth. The previous panels discussed systems or the patient. This will actually bring us all together and talk about full and informed choice of the clinical patient in becoming a research participant. And because the patients expect from the informed consent process can be really different based on their culture, their background, and human diversity in and of itself, there are a lot of broad and differing views that come to this topic. So with all of that in the background and everything we've talked about today, hopefully you can bring all that thinking together as we think about choice. Our first speaker this afternoon is John Wilbanks. John is the Chief Commons Officer for Sage BioNetworks, which is a nonprofit research organization that seeks to develop predictors of disease and accelerate health research to the creation of open systems, incentives, and standards. Previously, John worked as a legislative aide to Congressman Fortney Stark and served as the first assistant director of Harvard's Berkman Center for Internet and Society. He was also the executive director of Science Commons Project at Creative Commons. In February of 2013, in response to a We the People petition that was spearheaded by John and signed by 65,000 people, the federal government announced a plan to open up taxpayer-funded research data and make it available for free. So I am really pleased that John is part of our panel. I'm going to introduce everybody and then I'll welcome you up. Our second two speakers are representing the University of Michigan's Custoria Design Jam team. Harita Vadari is a student in the School of Public Health. Harita, if you want to raise your hand. And her colleague is Kelly Ho, a student from the School of Information. The Design Jam is a workshop hosted by the university's Innovation in Action program, which brings together students from across the various schools in health and law, and public health and information to develop innovative multidisciplinary solutions for health information network shared services to educate patients on their healthcare consent rights. And I think it's really, really neat that we're going to have some of our student representatives talking about research that will take us into sort of the future thinking of this field. Our last speaker is Melissa Creary, who works at the intersection of public health science and technology studies and medical anthropology, with a focus on social, cultural, ethical, and political and historical tensions in the field of sickle cell disease in both the United States and Brazil. Melissa, if you want to raise your hand. Melissa is an assistant professor in the Department of Health Management and Policy in the University of Michigan School of Public Health, and she previously served as a health scientist at the CDC in the Division of Blood Disorders, where she helped to create the first national program and data collection system for sickle cell disease. She was also recently recognized by the Sickle Cell Disease Association of America with the National Champion Advocacy Award. And then joining us in our panel discussion is Dr. Raymond DeVries. Ray, who is someone I have come to know very well, has a wide area of research that includes regulation of science and the production of scientific knowledge in clinical trials of genetic therapies. He is an associate director of the University of Michigan Center for Bioethics and Social Sciences and Medicine and is a professor of learning health sciences and also a professor in the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology. He is also a visiting professor at the Care and Public Health Research Institute at the School of Public Health and Primary Care at the University of Maastricht in the Netherlands. And we welcome Ray. After all the presentations, we're going to come together as we've been doing in the morning sessions for discussion and questions. And with that, we're going to load the slides for John Wilbanks, and the floor is yours, John.
So what I wanted to start with, since this is a panel about choice, is a little bit about the broader technical environment. And to note that there is an axis forming between the technology industry and the research industry. And I think that that's something we need to think about as we think about the learning healthcare system, because there's a very good chance that we'll inherit the norms of the technology system as it is brought into the healthcare system if we don't think about it and have some intent. So I wanted to start this at church. It's here in Detroit, actually, very close. It holds 2,000 people. I have chosen this because up until a couple of years ago, this was the size of the largest longitudinal Parkinson's disease research study. And it's good to have a mental model of just how few people that is compared to technology, because Google A/B tests advertising on the state of Nevada versus the state of Utah. Right? That's the scale of the technology industry, and it's that scale that a lot of people desperately want as they try to bring technology into the research process. This is the way the data are collected in that particular Parkinson's study. I'm not singling it out, it's just because we've done stuff in Parkinson's, so I know it well. So there are 2 data collection points per year. One of those is in person, the other one is by phone or by survey. That's an incredibly thin sample size, right? From a generic perspective, 2,000 is a tiny sample size, and 2 data collection points per year is an incredibly sparse data sample for a disease that is chronic, degenerative, and deeply affected by lived experience and perspective. Now the opportunity, the reason that this axis is forming is that we can use phones. This is from a study that we run at SAGE. We enrolled 9,000 people in the first 24 hours that we ran the study. And we can quantitatively measure the phenotype pretty well, right? These same sensors that give you landscape and portrait give you tremor. In your pocket, they give you gait. Right? Tapping on the screen gives you dyskinesia. You can do memory tests. You can do all sorts of feedback like Warren talked about in his app from 10 years ago. And you can get these samples twice a day, every day, as long as people are willing to give you their data and do the work. Right? This is why the axis is forming. It's incredibly powerful. You can start to see individualized trends in people's lives as well as cohort level trends on literally a daily basis. You wake up in the morning and there's a fire hose of data waiting for you. This led Apple to the launch of the Research Kit framework. We were part of that. We were definitely the only nonprofit that was involved in that. And there's a reason why they got into this, and there's a reason why there are more than 50 apps out into the wild that we know of already using the framework, and it's because this immediate way to access people, right? Instead of mailing them surveys, you can push surveys to their phone, and most of the time they answer them as long as you're engaging them effectively. And it's not just Apple, right? Google has launched Project Baseline. How many people here are familiar with the Baseline study? Great. So they spent 3 years designing this watch and a sleep sensor. They are going to enroll 1 million people. They're going to do blood samples, genomes, phenotypes, sleep and watch, right? And all the data will be owned by Google. No data goes back to individuals, nothing, right? This is going to be a completely private study, and they have the money to do this at a scale that has usually been the province of governments. And the problem with this are the consent norms to me in many ways, right? So in technology, right, the only thing you ever consent to is giving them more. Right? That's the norm. And working with these companies, you have to move them off a normative process, which is why shouldn't we get all of the data and never give any of it back and never engage with people? Because we're going to give them products for free that balance out the value part of the risk perception. And if we don't think about this, we're going to get run over by it, because it's, the size and the scale and the power of these technology companies is something that is almost like geologic time. It's really hard to express how powerful they are. This is from this morning. It turns out that one of the things they do to track us around the internet is they run what are called replay scripts. So this is a replay of a person who visited Walgreens. In order to serve her more effective advertising, her entire visit was recorded in a cookie on her computer and later broadcasted to a set of third-party vendors who help people understand how to do marketing. In this context, she selected abortion and alcohol dependence as her 2 issues. This was sent unencrypted. This is the culture that we live in, and this is the culture that we're going to be offered in part of the research enterprise. Right? And the problem with consent that technology companies exploit is that we don't read very well on screens. Right? Physiologically, it depends on whether you do eye gaze fixation or time analysis. We read 1 out of 3 words maximum in print. Sorry, on screens compared to in print. Right? That's if we attempt to read it, which most of the time we don't. Right? We've become cultured to clicking OK on contracts that are between us and our goals on the internet. This is not an accident. Right? This is intentional. It's to keep us from paying attention to the terms. Right? Now, this creates opportunities, though. So the nice thing about electronic informed consent, which is where I spend the vast majority of my time, is that we're taking a really lousy in-person interaction where you're handed a form and not expected to read it, and we're given an opportunity. And so despite these technology companies jumping in, right, the existence of the regulatory friction is an opportunity, but only if we come in and we talk to a certain extent the language of the technology companies. If we can encode our norms into some products and designs that they recognize, then in many cases they will adopt them. So I'll show you what we came up with. So we spent 2 years doing qualitative interviews supported by AHRQ, Robert Wood Johnson, Helmsley Charitable Trust, Academy Health, looking at informed consent as it transitioned into an electronic context. And these are the 2 biggest findings. One was that everyone thought it was lousy and wanted it to get better, but nobody felt like they were able to change. Everyone felt like they were trapped by the default forms of their institution, their IRB processes, and their lack of agency as researchers. But everyone wanted it to work better. I mean, literally everyone we talked to, from database administrators to patients to clinicians to IRBs to lawyers, wanted informed consent to be more informing. And that was the opportunities. We said, okay, we can use technology to inform people, not just, hide things that we don't want them to read. And so what we came up with was the idea of creating interfaces to informed consent documents that were pedagogical. So we know empirically from research in web journalism that the combination of an on-task photograph, a headline, and a subheadline is engaging. It slows down the participant's experience to the same speed that it would be if they were in print. It doesn't work if the picture's off-task, interestingly, so the thesis is it's the cognitive load. There's a navigation to another layer that has more information. We work really hard on the language of these screens. This is actually one of the worst ones we wrote from a Fleisch-Kincaid readability scale perspective. We now, in all of our apps that we are pushing out this year, everything is at the 5th grade level on those screens. You can also use things like videos on these screens, animations. You can provide hyperlinked access out to information sources and let people navigate to the level of detail that they want. And of course, the only place you can go from this screen is back to the main screen so that you see the icon, headline, subheadline combo again. Because if you wanted more information, then probably it's good to reinforce that through the interaction. We pair this with either a summative or a formative assessment. We don't want people to just swipe their way into a research study, even if it's a low-risk study. In the beginning, everything we did was summative, which meant you had to get 100% right on the quiz to enter the study. We've had a lot of conversations with participants, and we've decided to move that to a formative assessment. In Parkinson's disease, some of our participants couldn't control their tremor enough to answer the questions right, for example. So now we have a formative assessment where we say, you got 4 out of 5 questions right. Do you want to proceed, or do you want to go back and go through the educational experience again? And what you get is this narrative, which the participant sees before they ever touch the document. Because again, we know statistically it's unlikely that they will read it, and if they try to read it, that they will probably not process all the words. So you go through this, you cannot get to the consent document until you get through the narrative. It takes anywhere from 2 to 15 minutes, depending on how fast you go through, how many screens you navigate to get through this on a general basis. All this went through our IRB, which we, as an independent nonprofit, we work with Western IRB. But it's now been through the IRBs at 26 research institutions as a way of doing consent for low-risk studies. The other thing we do, and this, and I apologize, I'm terrible with names, but the first speaker today talked beautifully about the problems with individual consent. And we've tried to actually allow an escape route, which is you can donate your data to broad consented studies and broad reuse. So we make this an option. We do not set a default because defaults prime people to choose the default option. But 70% of the enrollees across all of our studies select broad sharing of their data. Now we have a biased sample. We run on mobile phones, right? We understand all of this, but it's an impressively persistent number across conditions that we study, at least. We don't expect the data users to read our terms of service either. We do teach the participants about the choice through similar screens here, qualified researchers, shareable data. We don't just put data on the internet. The data users have to go through a designed process as well. So we sat down and we said, if we're going to let people donate their data to science, we need to have a process to vet the data users, because one breach of trust from a data user will destroy this entire system we're trying to create. So these are transaction costs we introduce in front of the data to reduce the predictable misuses or misusers. We spent a lot of time thinking about the right combination of these, and we decided that strict identity validation was an important part of preventing sort of anonymous attacking, harassing, trolling, doxing behavior. We make them pass a test. So it's a 13-question sort of LSAT-style test about using human data in the cloud. It's an annoying process. That's the point. We want people to get through who are motivated to get through. And if you are not willing to take a short test, you shouldn't get access to data. And then the data use statement, which is nice because we discovered participants really want to know what uses are happening. They'd like to be able to be notified, scroll through them. And then this is the last piece, which is that an oath tends to actually help people adhere to a contract that's hard to enforce. So everyone wants to use the data in the system, has to download, print, sign, scan, and upload the oath. And again, we use user theory from legal contracting, real estate. There's a reason they make you initial next to things, because it increases the odds that you look at them. So we have these 9 points that they have to sign. This goes on their publicly identified validated profile. And now what we're doing is trying to give away all the methods. So we've given away all of the icons, the design files, workflows, because your app developer will write you an app that starts collecting data the minute it's installed, not the minute people have consented. And so we try to provide some support for that. They will also do things like tell you that they've added full birthday to your study so that you can send people happy birthday notes. They'll do that 72 hours before you go to IRB, generally. In hopes that other people would pick these up. We didn't want them to have to work with us to do this, because this is just a methodology, it's a process. And we've got, at this point, we've enrolled 100,000 people across the studies that we operate at Sage. As far as we know, there's been another 250,000 enrolled using the visual layered consent method in studies that we're not involved in. And Apple actually put it into their research kit framework. So there's a value in having a design and a product that encodes your norms as a competitor, right? It's actually something that even these giant technology companies can actually wind up being vulnerable to in a way that is good. So I'll finish with this since we don't have a ton of time. So we've heard a lot about All of Us. Sage, my org, we're the awardee to work on informed consent as well as on shepherding clinical protocols, as well as doing some digital health sensor work. We're looking at really blowing up the interactions. So we think we should take the existing content, make it available via chat. A lot of people who have feature phones, non-smartphones, would like to interact through a chat interface or an SMS interface. We've heard from a lot of people that'd like to see all this content just as a video that they can watch. So we're in the process of working on both of those things. But I wanted to show you some of the wackier ideas we've got and hopefully get feedback. So this is how design works, right? You start with basically a Pinterest board. One of the things we're looking at is a sorting hat. Can we sort people who have clean ACMG results from people who have a clinically actionable ACMG result and give them different experiences before they access their results? Or do we need to give everybody the same experience? All these slides will be available, so I'm going to go fast to stay on time. A ballot box. A genetic counselor will frequently provoke you with statements like, did you know this about DNA, this thing that is unknowable, this thing you should be uncomfortable with? Are you comfortable? Do you want to know more? So the idea is that we provide statements that are designed to be provocative and uncomfortable and let people assess how comfortable or uncomfortable those statements make them, give them a score at the end and say, no, now that you know what you think, do you want to go forward or not? A game, right? There's a very powerful way of orientation through gaming where you can demonstrate knowledge of an environment by playing and completing a game. We're looking at all of these things. Stampy Cat, this is something that I think is, raise your hand if you know what Stampy Cat is. No Minecraft parents? There we go, couple, right? He has 6.1 billion views of himself playing Minecraft. And it's a way to teach Minecraft that has taught my 6-year-old son how to play Minecraft with no instruction. And we are ignoring it as a pedagogical tool, right? For not just for kids, but for adults. And then my favorite one, which is my last one, the Kobayashi Maru, which is from Star Trek. I'm not a Trekkie, but this came up. So you put the participant in the shoes of the actual study coordinator, and they have to make choices about benefits versus risk, harms versus outcomes, and let them see the trade-offs that are involved. And then say, now knowing this, do you want to proceed? Do you want to be involved, right? Put them into your shoes instead of trying to sort of game them through a system, right? This is the way we have to think about choice, because if we don't offer choice interactions like this, we're going to wind up with studies that look like the arthritis study that came out from GSK over the summer, where there was an 11-point document in PDF form that you could either click or not. Right? That's where it's coming, because the speed, the depth, the velocity of the data that's available is so attractive to the scientist that they're actually pretty aligned with the company's norms, not with research norms. So, out of all of this, the main thing is don't sort of stop by thinking and writing a paper about how we ought to do things. Try to start designing things that encode your norms, because those designs can take off and scale in ways that the paper will never do. And please contact me. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. So yes, we had a nice introduction, but thanks for the opportunity for speaking here. We're just here talking about an approach to redesigning health data management, and I'll kind of go behind the story of how we all came together. There's 5 of us, and actually the rest of our team members are in the audience. And
Go ahead and stand up.
there. And we're a mix of students from the School of Public Health, the School of Information, and the School of Law School. And we kind of came across a situation, and I'll talk a little bit more about it, but I'll start it off with how we got together and kind of going through what our approach was and what we presented to everyone. So we met at these U of M Multidisciplinary Design Jam. This is some pictures of that evening. And how it was is that it was a 4-hour workshop on a Friday evening, and they opened it up to multiple schools, but it was, created by the Innovation and Action Group in the School of Public Health. And we all came in, we were pre-assigned to groups, and they wanted to have multiple disciplines in each group, which was important for the collaborative process. And we were presented with this problem with designing a tool or policy that accounts for different informed consent policies, electronic consent management capabilities, and patient preferences for data sharing among multiple users. Which is a mouthful, and I think most of us Friday evening had no idea what that was talking about. And most of us in our group had no idea what this was all about. I put the date there specifically showing that we were only introduced to this topic about a month ago. And before that, we had no knowledge of learning health systems or consent or anything in healthcare systems. So this, I'm just kind of setting your expectations on what we might be presenting, but it might be a little bit of an overlap with what everyone else has talked about. But we're excited to talk about our idea, and we'll get started.
Right, yeah. Thank you. So, just like what Harita has said, it's going to be echoed a lot with what's already covered. So just some overview about the current situation within the field of informed consent. So we emphasize on 2 things. First, there are numerous challenges within the field of informed consent. And second, our health data is extremely fragmented. And informing is hard, yeah, of course. And first, why? Health providers just don't do it well. Doctors are not trained to inform patients. Whenever I go visit a doctor, they never tell me what's in the consent form. You just need to sign the consent form or not. So patients are left unaware of the meaning or the results of signing those consent forms. And as just like what was brought up like earlier, we don't read the terms like ever. So there's actually one study that's showing people actually agree to give out their force forms as one of the clauses because we just don't read. Yeah, and
They got Wi-Fi.
yeah, and of course it's understandable because there are just too many options there for consent. There's like opt-in, opt-out, opt-in with restrictions, opt-out with restrictions. So they're just confusing. And there's this idea about resignation. So it turns out the more educated you are, the more likely you will just give out your information because you know your data is already being used by, I don't know, everybody. So in terms of the, why it's not moving? It's not working. Okay. Yeah, so in terms of the data, so yeah, it is just shattered around. So now, because first, each health agency is using the information like individually and within their own health system. So hospitals, clinicians, individual doctors, insurance companies, they all use different parts of the information in different format. So because of that, there's really poor health information sharing because of the laws and regulations between different states and incompatible systems of different health systems. Because like, I don't know, like different softwares, different databases, and different format of the file that you're using. So a lot of times, hospitals are using fax to just sharing information. And finally, as individual users, like around the house, we just have those piles of like random papers of your hospital visit. And so what now? Oh, just like this. So what now? So we propose that we really want one single point of access to your health data and to a way to get education about your consent form. And more importantly, we want more control about our own data. And I think this kind of ties back to the trust issue of like, because we have more control, now we may be able to like trust our health providers a little bit more. And this is the framework that we are proposing. We call this IMI, the Insurance Medical Information, where as an individual patient, you sign up your insurance. When you sign up for your insurance, you are also giving out your consent. So what we're talking about here is that we are shifting the responsibility of educating patients about the consent forms to insurance companies. So basically, this is how it works. You use your phone or use your Wi-Fi to sign up with your insurance company, and then you get this little tutorials over there. It can be video, and it can be the things that just be introduced over there during the last presentation. And then you will be notified about what you're going to sign up for, and then you will get this insurance card, which would work as a key to a cloud storage of all your electronic health record. And this key is going to be encrypted with a chip, maybe, ideally. And then whenever you go to a hospital and visit the hospital, you will show this key to your health providers, to your doctors, and your doctors will be able to access your electronic health records in that storage. And also, they can upload the information, upload the visit, the records into that storage as well. So at that way, our individual users will be the main player here to manage our own data, and it will be able to give a say, saying, oh, this is the information I want to give you, and to what extent. So, yep.
So I guess I didn't add it in the beginning, but we were actually the winning team that evening, and that's why we're here. We had the opportunity to talk about our pitch. Thank you. But I think what our feedback that evening, one of the reasons why we were chosen out of the, I think there were about 6 or 7 teams, was because we incorporated insurance into the discussion. Whether or not it's a feasible option, that's a different point because it's only been a month. We're still doing research, but we felt that insurance was something as a good place to start with because they have an established infrastructure already. They're already connecting with patients and they're already connecting to healthcare providers. we don't have to really start a new infrastructure. And they're already storing healthcare data. I talked to my primary care physician, and he's talking about how he has to upload all of the patient records electronically, get sent to the insurance company, and then they do some analysis, and then they send it back. So this type of exchange of healthcare data is already happening in some way. I did say majority of Americans are insured. That could be it's either a high number or low number. I haven't gotten the exact number, but to at least start it off, to check out to see how insurance companies can be part of this consent process, I feel like there's enough people to work with, because most of the people have some type of insurance or some type of, payer plan that they can work with to see how consent can be given to the insurance companies to deal with. As per our research for the past 3 weeks, we've been looking at a lot of working systems around the world just to see what are other countries doing. And we kept coming back to European countries, because they do seem to do healthcare a little bit differently than the US. And we did notice, like, the Netherlands has a nonprofit that oversees, they like opt-in and opt-out type of thing in the system, and patients have the ability to access their own information and be able to change consent and everything. In the UK, it is said in a lot of literature that physicians ask them consistently every single time they enter a office, like, what is your consent, your permission for today or tomorrow? And patients can then go to kiosks and healthcare clinics and constantly update consent and permission of their healthcare data. Not saying that anything is right or wrong, but a lot of countries are already it seems like everyone in the world is trying to figure out how to deal with this problem. And those are different ideas that we were kind of looking at, like, okay, so countries are doing something like this, it's not impossible. I also wanted to include the VA in the US, because the VA seems to be a really prime example of how a well-connected system works in the US, because they seem to do some things very differently than what the normal healthcare infrastructure does in the US. And I feel like we can learn a lot from them on basis of how they manage healthcare data, especially with people being able to travel state to state but still be able to have control over their healthcare data, even if they change physicians. Going forward, I think our biggest thing is to network and understand the problem much more in a deeper level. I guess it was a great opportunity for us to be here with everyone and listen to all the talks since morning, to just really learn about what is going on in the field, because like I think previous speakers have mentioned, we don't do this full time. We're in class most of the time, and this is a completely brand new subject for us. And we do realize there are challenges. There is a lot of mistrust with insurance companies, and a lot of people, maybe that's why they've not been included in this discussion, but we hope to open that dialogue to see maybe they are another entity that would like to be involved in this discussion, especially maybe they want to improve their image of mistrust in the society. But they're also trying hard to connect with patients because of, creating better websites for patients to access their information. They're getting into apps. They are trying to deal better with patients. So maybe giving them that responsibility of consent kind of goes along with their 10-year plan, maybe, because they could probably incorporate it in their structure. But for now, I think we want to focus on healthcare exchange, just because of the amount of data, and you go to a doctor's office and how consent has not really been talked about. I go to my primary care physician and I'm not really too sure about how is consent communicated to me. So I think we want to focus on that, but after hearing everyone's talks today, I do realize that consent is much more broader, especially in research and genomic studies, and we want to just open and see how we can incorporate all types of consent and all different situations in the future. And we are planning to go forward with this innovation and action competition, part of the School of Public Health, with this idea. And so that's why we are in the process of interviewing and trying to talk to insurance companies, healthcare providers, patients, just to better see what the problem is and understand the problem. So we would really also appreciate feedback from everyone in the audience today too, and just to get a better understanding of our idea and how that idea would work in the broad scale of things. Thank you.
Hi, all. Good afternoon. I stand between you and the reception, I think. Thank you.
There's alcohol at the reception.
Oh,
No
I'm
pressure.
standing in between you and alcohol. I'm sorry. Thank you for still being here this afternoon. So just like everyone else, I'm going to give the preface that learning health systems is not where I am steeped, that I might be an outlier for the rest of the speakers, and that a lot of what I'm going to talk about takes place in Brazil. So I want you to travel with me. Also, as was mentioned in my introduction, I take an interdisciplinary view at health policy. So that means that history will be involved, anthropology will be involved, some sociology will be involved in how we think about inclusion and exclusion, which is the title of my talk, Bounded Justice and Tensions Between Inclusion and Exclusion and the Implications for Learning Health Systems. So I'm hoping that by the end of this that you'll be able to get something from where I situate myself, which is around areas of race and ancestry and citizenship, and what that means for knowledge production for particular groups, particularly marginalized groups. So I come to you today, as many of you, wearing several hats. I'm a newish professor in the School of Public Health with expertise in health policy, social movements, and knowledge production, using sickle cell disease in Brazil as the lens to tell these stories. I was also, before this, served as a health scientist in the Division of Blood Disorders at the CDC for almost a decade, serving those living with hemophilia, thalassemia, and sickle cell disease via partnerships with national organizations, educational institutions, and healthcare systems. And before all of this, I was born with sickle cell disease. And so in studying sickle cell disease from the government's perspective, a researcher's perspective, and my very own personal lived experience perspective, I have seen the tensions between power, legitimacy, and efficacy. Sickle cell disease is an important political site in which race, citizenship, biological determinism, ancestry, and health are contested. Within sickle cell disease, we can also interrogate how both science and race are constructed and how hard it is to disentangle the two. Currently, I study how social health movements in Brazil for sickle cell disease have led to policy change on the local level. This was done through policy processes that were embedded in the Brazilian Constitution. Physicians worked to ensure that every citizen was guaranteed health as a right. Further, the state mandated that individuals from disease-based organizations like sickle cell disease had to sit at the proverbial table for the development, maintenance, and evaluation of health policy. Epistemic authority for knowledge production around sickle cell disease in Brazil lay mostly at the feet of elite scientists associated with established institutions. These gatekeepers often focus on the biological and medical processes that take place within the body. In opposition to this line of thinking are those who work within the state-sponsored public health infrastructure with strong ties to the sickle cell disease movement, who have successfully shifted the focus from inside the body to outside. Further, many in the social movement deem any interest from scientists in this population to be based in a paradigm that creates the person living with sickle cell disease as a commodity to clinical science with a lack of legitimate knowledge to contribute to the scientific discourse. The static and biological definition of sickle cell disease is reconfigured by the state and its Afro-Brazilian citizens. This co-production of health policy is based on both biological and cultural distinction. These distinctions were attached by citizen and state alike to Blackness, despite a patient pool that spans the phenotypic spectrum, particularly in Brazil. This reconfiguration occurred in part by the 1988 reformed federal constitution, here's some history, which built in language that mandated that sickle cell disease communities had to be part of the development, maintenance, and evaluation of health policy in conjunction with the Ministry of Health. Despite this constitutional mandate for inclusion in policy, the societal and cultural influences to genomic discourse provided by sickle cell disease activists are discredited by scientists. There is a failure to recognize the impact of culture and history on science in the same way that the state and others do so for policy. Even though these citizens were at the table, they still weren't really being heard. This tension between the processes of inclusion and the structural limitations of being seen is what I call bounded justice. As I define it, it is an attempt to distribute health rights without disturbing the underlying mechanisms that generated the initial inequalities in the first place. Its performance hinges on the historico-geographical context in which it is situated and can permeate any number of medical, social, and ethical realms. So how might bounded justice be applicable for us today as we think about consent, especially with marginalized populations? In the Brazilian case, bounded justice is linked to a larger concept I call biocultural citizenship, a deep entanglement of biology and culture as shown through Brazilian actors who attempt to gain access to fuller citizenship. For the sake of time, we won't go into detail about this conceptual model, except to understand that there are three layers here, biological, cultural, and societal. Bounded justice operates in the social realm. Any justice that occurs, like allowing for the marginal to have a seat at the table to begin with, is bounded in nature due to the undeniably inequitable society in which it occurs. In Brazil, there are two sides involved in the production of bounded justice. On one side is the state, which is not interested in redistributing power beyond that required by a legislative mandate to address inequality. On the other are political activists with sickle cell disease who have been given a seat at this proverbial table with no real political capital. The limited experience of Afro-Brazilians in wielding political power is a result of very active racism and the legacy of the collective and cultural trauma of slavery. This anemic attempt at justice by the state is also limited by the social reality that production of limited knowledge about the science and medicine of sickle cell disease is still dominated by individuals and institutions with no ties to the Black health movement. So herein lies the conflict between science and the social movement public, if you will. Different sectors of society, science, private sector, public agencies, and civil society, they organize knowledge and action according to individual timescales, categories, priorities, etc. Members of each culture may look at the same situation and come to opposite conclusions of what is and what has to be done. Based on their cultural norms, knowledges, practices, and discourses, they focus on the various elements of the situation and interrelate and interpret them differently. The concept of biocultural citizenship, as mentioned earlier, helps frame the thought processes of those in the sickle cell disease movement and state health apparatus. It recognizes that in Brazil, sickle cell disease is both a biological phenomenon and an urgent cultural issue that is legitimized by its African origins. This cultural reconfiguration of sickle cell disease, as shaped by these interlocutors, often Black and further delegitimized by their lack of medical and research experience, mandate that specific definitions of sickle cell disease take this frame as well. This is in Portuguese, I will explain. Those in the public health apparatus and sickle cell disease movement resist the normative ways that scientific or epidemiologic knowledge is produced. Consider this text from a slide set from the Bahia Association for People with Sickle Cell Disease titled Incidence Data for Sickle Cell Disease in Brazil. This was the third introductory slide to explain the disease's origins. And it reads, sickle cell disease was not brought from Africa by enslaved Blacks. It is a consequence of criminal uprooting. Ignorance and disregard for this disease result from the process of colonization, segregation, and racism in Brazil and the Americas. Those inserted in the sickle cell disease movement are keenly aware of the ways in which biology, culture, and society are intertwined. Though this presentation, not mine, is about data, they demonstrate a biocultural positioning by usurping how epidemiology is framed. So sociologist Janet Shim tells us that the construction of epidemiologic knowledge and its application in clinical practice can be seen as an example of a power-knowledge relation. Lost it. The production and centralization of knowledge in order to maximize control over individual and social bodies. Those in the movement, and even those tangential to it, participate in the social infrastructure of biomedical knowledge production in ways that are contrary to those seen in the scientists. In an ethics framework for a learning healthcare system, Ruth Faden, and I've been hearing this name throughout the day, Ruth Faden and colleagues propose a departure from traditional research ethics and clinical ethics. She and her colleagues argue for a specific novel obligation on health professionals and healthcare institutions to be active contributors to learning in healthcare. And she argues that a similar obligation extends to patients, 5 minutes, got it, who have traditionally not been conceived in research ethics as having duty to contribute to the ongoing learning that is integrated with the healthcare they receive. So how do we navigate the tensions between what is deemed historically legitimate by the standards of science in terms of learning in healthcare? We need to know that the ways of knowing can't always be standardized. If we want to honor all of the voices involved in the learning process, and we ourselves want to learn how to better bridge notions of inclusion, we must be prepared to question what is valued on a systemic and structural level. This means that we push against the norms of how data is collected and how data is reported. We understand that in valuing all voices, we must reach beyond a purely biomedical construct in the ask. In recognition that the sickle cell communities that I work with, their own activist efforts are steeped in the assertion of their personal and political identities, it was incumbent upon me as a researcher to embrace a methodology that would be attentive to the nuance of individual personhood and collective narrative. By utilizing oral history as part of my data collection, I am centering the voices of the community and allowing for a representativeness that might not be foregrounded in typical public health work. I use these voices to tell a wider story about policy development and embodiment. I am intentional about marginalized voices being added to the archive as contribution to the scholarly conversations about race, ancestry, and policy. It is unwise to assume that only geneticists can contribute to these conversations. The advocates I met were indeed quite savvy about their genetic profile and its utility. I worked to be intentional that there is reach beyond the ivory tower. Yes, the currency of academia is in peer-reviewed publications. I know this. Lord knows I know this. But it is of equal or greater value that you create products that can be of use to the very communities that have given themselves to you. So for me, this means the creation of products available for those in the sickle cell disease movement in Brazil, audio, video, and image archives, accessible text in Portuguese. There must always be an intention of reciprocity and hope that these products further empower a community to utilize the science they contribute to and enhance the healthcare that they receive. This kind of methodology, I understand, is not one that is easily applied to many research initiatives, but I bring it up to make a point about intentionality. I know that great work is being done in conceptualizing the return of value to participants of a learning system once they've consented. But how do we begin to normalize the valuing of the patient themselves? How do we normalize the presence of underserved populations at NIH meetings or meetings like this? How do we normalize discussions about social, political, and historical forces at every step of the learning activity, but particularly around ideas of consent? How do we dig deep and call out our own and other biases at every step? I will end here by saying that if we are truly invested in co-creating a learning health system, it's going to mandate a close examination of the viewpoint of consent as inclusionary, given the exclusionary practices that are put in place by society. This will be a slow and messy process, even slower and messier given that some elements of the system may now be deemed as hostile. In the United States, the marginalized have historically been conscripted for experimental medical research while denied access to quality health care. As an informant in a study by Ruha Benjamin said, "Why am I in such demand as a research subject when no one wants me as a patient?" We must continue to be creative in our inclusivity, and we must be well aware of what it may cost us and do it anyway. That is it. I look forward to a rich discussion that is going to be led by Ray and Doreen, and also some booze. And I hope that this was provoking of some questions that will help end the session on a productive note. Thank you.
So at this time, we're going to do the same thing we did earlier today, and we're going to start with Dr. DeVries initiating our discussion with a question or comment.
Great. A further impediment to getting you to the alcohol. I didn't even realize it was alcohol. So a couple comments. I think this is a fine conclusion to what we've been doing all day, which is thinking about how do we engage the public in the work of learning health systems. And we've heard everything from kind of a wonderful macro socio-cultural study and thought about this issue to some very technical solutions to how we engage the public. So I want to get to consent, but you know, I'm a sociologist by training, which means that what I am really is a professional voyeur. So even though I'm in a Department of Learning Health Sciences and a Center for Bioethics, I really see myself as someone who, in this case, I'm watching bioinformaticists and I'm watching ethicists as they kind of struggle to build these new systems and trying to figure out what's going on here. So before we get to consent, just a couple comments. I've been taking notes throughout the day. It's a function of having been a sociologist who does a lot of observations, so you're an inveterate note taker. There were a couple of things that occurred to me. I know it's not popular anymore in this post-Foucauldian age to talk about deconstruction and problematizing, but there are a couple of things in listening throughout the day, and I hope this sets the context for talking about consent, that I think we have some more work to do, and other speakers have brought this up. You know, learning health systems. What do we mean by health? I mean, I think all of us come in here, but that was a question that was raised. For me, another question that I've heard no one raise that I think is really critical is, what do we mean by learning? How do we learn? And a couple different times today it was said that, I think I have a quote here, we have to learn from every patient. Now in principle, I think we can all agree with that. But as a sociologist, I wonder, what does it mean for the relationship between a caregiver and a patient when you're in here, and my goal is not just to help you with what you're dealing with, but it's also to learn from you. And all of a sudden you become a means to an end rather than an end itself, to quote Kant. So I think that's another area we need to think more about. What do we mean by learning, and are we only learning through data? What about experience? What about intuition? I mean, those things disappear in a learning health system because I'm not sure we can digitize those. Maybe we can, but for the moment, what we want is the blood pressure cuff reading to go right to the computer. As we heard earlier, don't mess this up with annotating things because that creates cost, that creates error. But I think there are other ways of learning. So again, I'm problematizing. Another thing that hadn't occurred to me until we heard about from some of these things from law is, what are the boundaries of the body? Where does the body end? I mean, you know, I've watched enough TV detective shows to see, like, give him a Coke, and then when he leaves, we'll take the DNA off the. Wow, that's his body on there. And I think where the boundaries of the body are is another thing that is interesting and needs some more thought than we've given it. Okay, enough of that context. I want to talk a bit about consent. I think we've heard a bunch of intriguing ideas here, especially from the first two speakers, very intriguing ideas about consent. And again, how do we engage the public? Another thing I've done is I've done some research asking members of the public how they feel about consent for biobanking. And a lot of us who have done that, I think we've all learned that consent is a really poor vehicle for getting people to agree about what's going to happen to their stuff, as we call it. We've kind of moved beyond that. You know, it's not a great vehicle for a person to decide what's going to be used with their biospecimens. And what we're coming to are systems of governance. I mean, a lot of you know that. We're talking now about how do we govern biobanks, how do we govern systems of big data. And the underlying thing that wasn't a topic of any of our three talks, and it came up in every session, was trust, right? We know people engage with us to the extent that they trust who we are, and we worried about lack of trust, and we were interested in how to generate trust. And so this kind of brings me to a question that I'd like to hear my colleagues speak to a little bit. It seems to me that trust requires listening, and I want to go back to Deborah's example of parks and parking lots. Right? I mean, we live in the era of highly polarized publics, right? We hear people from the other side, the people we don't disagree with, you know, we laugh at them, we think they're idiots, but we don't listen to them. So we hear the example of, why would people prefer parking lots to parks? Come on, we like parks. That's crazy. But Deborah made the comment, it's like, hey, maybe we should listen to them. And if we listen to them, they might tell us that parks are places that to them are dangerous or are a waste of money. And I think too often we end up dismissing one of the main features of trust is knowing that you're listened to, knowing that what you care about is heard. more killings yesterday, right? How could you not be for gun control? We don't listen to those people who are opposed to gun control. We just think they're a bunch of idiots, at least the people I hang out with. So I think, we don't have trust between the two parties. So sorry, I'm going on a little riff here. But what I'm interested in hearing from you people are thinking about new ways of generating consent. One, do you agree with me that trust is an important element? And if it's true, how do your new techniques, I'm especially speaking to the first two talks, but also to yours, how would they generate the kind of trust we need to engage participation in learning health systems? Easy question.
Do you want me to go first while you?
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm used to making stuff up. It's true, right? It's a great question. And I'm struck by Melissa's concept of bounded justice as a really powerful way to think about all of this, right? I mean, it's beautiful. Because it's easy to trust when the outer layer of the circle benefits you. It's much easier to trust quickly, I think. And a lot of the trust that I think that we've constructed in the consumer society, not like us at the table, but us as a society, is trust in the device, right? Trust in scale. Those two things will make everything better if you just ignore all of the crap that's happening around them, right? Don't worry about your data. Did you see that we can navigate you from here to there and give you a coupon for McDonald's on the way? Mm-hmm. Right? And that's a lot of the sort of cultural digital trust we've got is, yeah, I know it's creepy, but look at the products. In our own work at SAGE, we learned a lot. We worked with a disease group early on before we did electronic consent, just in trying to build a portal for them to analyze and collate their own data. I don't know how to build trust. I can tell you how to destroy it. One of them is to not worry about cultural and context collapse between different groups when they try to work together. Because the patients had very different ideas about data than we did and what mattered, because we didn't ask them first. So what we do now is we do a lot of ethnographic work before we get into something, because that at least helps us avoid catastrophic predictable mistakes. Right? That's one way you can build trust, is by talking to people first. Another way you can do it is by listening to the critique without getting mad, right? And a third thing you can do is to be transparent. Right? You're not going to be perfect. You're not going to not make mistakes, but you can be transparent about what happened, why it happened, and a commitment to fix it going forward. And then the fourth is sort of, I'm not a Reaganite, but people will trust but verify. Once they've gotten a little bit of trust, they'll watch you. And they'll see how you behave. And if you are transparent, it's very difficult to hide when you're being an asshole. Right? It's a very effective boundary function. Right? But if you sort of go through these things, right, ask people, listen to feedback, right, accept critique, be transparent, and fix things. It's like telling people to lose weight by eat less and exercise, right? It's not complicated. It's hard. It's hard to do it every day. It's hard to wake up every day and be like, shit, we made a mistake yesterday. I don't want to deal with it. But if you do that over time, you will build trust. It just doesn't build at that scale. That's why I sort of wanted to start with scale, which is we're obsessed with like asymptotic scale as a society, as a government, as business. And trust doesn't scale asymptotically, right? Trust scales slowly. And that's one of the reasons why it's been easy to build systems that don't have any in them, right? But the opportunity here is from the friction that these students who just got introduced to a month ago, I'm very sorry, by the way, to this system, is all this friction that's protected us from innovation, and it has, right? But it's also protected us from pollution in a very real sense. And so we have this opportunity to actually say, all right, what do we think trust is? How do we measure it, right? How do we build systems that encode it? We actually have a chance to do that here because of this moment. But the minute anyone says that they can scale trust, right, hold your wallet. Sorry, now you have to answer.
I mean, I guess I have nothing like new to add to that, but I think as we were coming up with our idea, we kind of went to consent first because that was the problem that was given to us, and that seems to be a big problem. But we haven't yet gone out and talked to people and talked to the community to see even if it is an issue that people think that is serious enough to fix. And we're kind of in the process of discussing that to see like maybe we should modify our idea a little bit, because if consent is more of an issue for the science community and not as much of an issue for the actual community that we're protecting, then maybe we have to go about it differently. And I think that's something that we've also been discussing as well.
You still want me to say
Oh,
something?
I do.
Is trust important? Yes. A little bit, tiny bit. But I think the question remains: how do we collectively build it? Given again, all of these things that society has imprinted. And I agree that we start with giving stuff for free. We start with showing up consistently. We start with owning up to our mistakes at every level. But I think it also starts with what I ended with, which is being intentional from the beginning to end, with the questions that you need to ask, with the biases that you need to confront from the very beginning, that you build that into the design. Also, as I said, it's not easy, right? Who's in the room and who gets to make the decisions and who gets to say that this is knowledge in the first place. So when we can begin to kind of shift what we think is legitimate knowledge, then we can begin to shift how we delve out and receive trust, I think.
Well, there was one comment earlier, I think it was in the first panel, where you said about warranted trust, right? We talked about and so we're talking about a lot about concepts that philosophers talk about, right? So I mean, in epistemology, which is what I studied, right, we talk about justified true belief, right? I wrote my senior thesis on warrant, right, as a process, right? There are ways that you can think about and construct these things, right? But they're really hard, right? And if I build it without talking to anybody else, I'm going to build it for me, right? And so that's the number. I mean, if you want to have like an actual takeaway for the question, is get a really diverse team together to talk about it at the start, because that will help you. You might not be more creative than you would have been, but you'll absolutely catch predictable and catastrophic mistakes, right? And that's one of the features of our culture right now, is you make predictable and catastrophic mistakes one after the other after the other.
Knowing that they could have been avoided if we had just
Talk to people,
Yeah.
right? Included people, right? That's.
But
again, it's-
there's a question that several of us in this room have wrestled with, and talk to people. Who are those people, and how do you bring the people together? A lot of us in this room have done public deliberation, and we do that, but we also walk away thinking, were those the people? I mean, who showed up for our deliberation? I'm intrigued by the idea of using ethnography, because it's like, instead of inviting people, you go to the people.
you have to go to the people.
That's
So
what that's what
ideas
we
on
do.
that would be, yeah.
I mean, the funny thing is that modern software design has stolen the idea of ethnography, right? So almost anyone you talk to says they're an interaction designer. There's actually a very funny meme, which is, I'm not sure if it's ethnography or just hanging out, right, in the interaction design world. But the idea is that you try to find groups of 10 people who look like the group that you're trying to work with, and you interview them in a structured way. And the whole concept of design is that's how you convert that into a product or a feature. It's actually a really powerful system, and we mainly use it to do advertising. But when you apply it to something like informed consent, what you discover is the existing experience is so crappy, right? Because it started out as this human-mediated thing where the doctor would teach you what was in the document, or not, depending on who you were and what you looked like. And the economics have limited the doctor's time to do that. And so now you have this experience where everyone's experience of informed consent generally is, they gave me a document in the middle of 20 other documents and just told me to sign them all and not worry about it. So nearly any design process is going to beat that. And that's kind of where we are in health, right? We wrote it down as an opportunity and a weakness on our table, because it means that a really toxic product will gain market share, right? People will ignore the terms if it gives them enough value, right? But the opportunity is to actually, right, take some of these inclusive principles and design something. Like, I love the fact that you're giving products back, right? You think about it that way, because that's how you can actually get people to trust you. They use a product that works, they understand it, right? And then maybe they'll trust you to do the next thing. But the trust is conditional, and the trust will be destroyed much faster than it will be created. Right? And so ethnography is not the magic answer, but it will help you avoid making predictable and catastrophic mistakes at the beginning. Right? It's the start of the process. It's the eat less part, right? Not the exercise part.
I think at this time we'll open up to the audience for more comment on this topic or questions of a different nature. Karen D.
Yeah, so I just wanted to say one, that I think the approach that you've taken for Research Kit and Sage with, and having this very open interface for people to enroll is a really interesting one. And really think that is kind of one way to address some of these in the technology with. The comment I wanted to make was that I had the pleasure of working with Warner Slack at Beth Israel Deaconess, who was one of the kind of grandfathers of informatics, and was the first person to build a computer that could talk to a patient. And at that time, that computer was the size of a room, vacuum tubes. And so he was thinking about trust even at that point. And so when he designed a machine that could take a history from a patient, it was like little rolls of paper coming out, kind of all low tech by today's standards. His philosophy was, for every question he asked a patient, he gave them an option, don't know, and none of your damn business. He was at Wisconsin at the time. And actually, he now is on the clinical informatics team and still kind of emeritus and practicing clinical informatics at Beth Israel Deaconess. And so their patient portal, any question they ever ask a patient, has those two additional options slightly G-ified in their rating. But I think that's, in his experience, that was a really good way to build trust when you ask patients questions, is to acknowledge that not only can they leave it blank, they can actually mark off none of your darn business as a way to say, not only do I not want to give that to you, I want you to know I don't want to give that to you. And some of his history-taking work was published in New England Journal many, many years ago, because he was able to show that he could get a better history out of patients than a physician could using the software. When I say software, but realistically it's actually hardware, because it was punch cards at the time. So just wanted to share that. I think that's, in technology, that's been an issue going way back. And I think at that time scale wasn't the problem. And now, as you pointed out, how do you scale something like that? But I think those two considerations, when we ask people questions, to give them that opportunity to react to that, was something I took away from that.
Great point. I'll just say thanks for that.
Any other questions from the audience? I think you're all still awake.
They want the booze.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so regarding with the trust, like our idea about this whole system is actually, we're not like directly tackling this really hard issue about trust. Like, we are actually providing this apparatus that you don't really have to deal with that many trust issues, because we are trying to make this data, your health record, to like a relatively independent position where you have the key and you are the one that telling the hospitals, health providers, that just like the back what he just mentioned about like giving them the your position about how do you feel about giving out these data of your like especially your health information. So now give you like more freedom to control. So kind of avoid this like the frictions or the direct conflicting between the trust between like two parties or even multiple parties. So that's our idea behind this whole system. So, yeah.
And certainly at a general level, right? So one of the reasons you might have seen the machine do a little bit better is that there's a pretty significant power imbalance between the physician and the patient, right? And we've seen this in consent, which is there's a social pressure on you to say yes to what your doctor asks you. And so you see a lot of abandonment of consent after people say yes, then they leave and they don't ever come back for the appointment. Whereas you feel much more liberated to tell the truth to a machine. Right? And this is why inquiries into the systemic way we use machines are important. Right? Like, if you're giving Walgreens that information because you think it's safe, and Walgreens is reselling that to people just to give you better ads. Right? Like, one of the biggest questions we get asked when we talk to participants is, are you selling stuff? And we say, we make revenue as a nonprofit, most everyone when it comes to grants. Nothing that you give us will ever go to an advertiser, period. Right? And we've actually been talking about ways that we can bind ourselves to that further, because if we broke that, it would be a contract violation, which is a very weak legal remedy, going back to the lawyers from earlier, right? It's so if we violated that, if we decided to sort of become evil, right? We would not be that exposed to a lawsuit. So some of the questions are, how can we make ourselves liable to our participants so that they can sue us if we violate, right? Because that's, again, one of the other ways that you can build trust is by exposing yourself to someone, right? Not in a Weinstein context, right? But in a very specifically say, I'm going to let myself be vulnerable to you, right? In a way that you're vulnerable to me, right? Because that can level some of the power settings. That's really hard to do. It freaks out corporate attorneys real fast, right? Like, you want to do what? Like, we want to be exposed to those people because they're exposed to us. Because that'll create that part of that verify part, which is it's not just that I trust you, it's that if you screw up, I have a remedy available. And one of the things we've lost in consumer culture is the concept of a remedy, right? If a bridge fails, people get sued. If software fails, they don't, right? And so there are all sorts of things that we have, like labor unions for contractors that help us build trust, right? Or bonds, where you know, the bail bond creates trust between the criminal and the state to a certain extent, right? There are all sorts of structures that are non-digital that help create and maintain trust. We leverage almost none of them in technology, and that's a shame.
Yes, in the blue.
I might be wrong, but I thought if you posted your privacy policy online and you violated it, you would be subject to the jurisdiction of the Federal Trade Commission and you could have enforcement proceedings.
In theory.
Oh, okay. Well,
I mean, there's not been very many cases brought. There's not a lot of fear of it, right? FIPS are voluntary, right? You can always just issue a new privacy policy that says if you don't delete your data within 24 hours, the new privacy policy maintains, right?
Well, it's just if you posted it, you said how could we bind ourselves? You could bind yourself by posting it, leaving it, not changing it.
Well, and we do that obviously, but I'm talking about skin in the game, right? Like if our patients might lose their insurance, there should be something that we can lose, right? Because then symmetry helps create trust, right? But right now, everything we do is asymmetric to the companies and the organizations that we interact with. And so one way is labor unions, right? Cooperatives of patients that could negotiate at a corporate scale. That's one way to go. But the other way is for the organizations themselves to create voluntary exposure and liability.
I lost my thought.
Do you want us to come back? Go ahead.
Something I keep coming back to is you, John, talked about designing things to that encode our norms, and that theme of that concept of we just talked about we have different ways of brokering, to create trust, right? We have bail bonds, we have data brokers, we have the government, right, that kind of oversees some of this, and hasn't evolved yet into technology, and I think that those values are still growing. I think we don't know what we don't know. We don't know the risks that we're even at, So I don't know. I don't really have a question about that, but I still keep coming back to, having this warranted trust. It kind of assumes that we all want, like in a learning health system, that we all want a better, increased patient well-being, but there's so many other people dipping into the learning health system, right? There's corporations who make the technology. What's their bottom line? Is their bottom line is the priority, not someone else's well-being. Talk about creating trust with, ethnography, going out and asking people what they want. What would work for you? Let's say go to a Native American reservation. Do you need more money? Do you need us to use the money to take the blues away or something? I don't know. You know what I mean? Like going to ask people what they need and doing it in a way that uses their norms. I don't think what I loved about the consent process that you showed, but it really interacted with people to help them understand what was going to happen to them in the study. I like that. I work for the IRB, and we do consents all the time. I like that the data was right up there at the front, as opposed to at the end where someone's tired of reading about the study. Yet it's really important for that researcher down the line to say, oh, I want to share this data, and they, no one's thought about it until later. What I didn't quite understand is if they've gone through all of that and then you get to the consent document, why is the document even there? Is it really necessary to have?
Legal requirement.
So legal, yeah. So, yeah. And I spent a lot of time making sure those legal requirements are in the consent, And it's unfortunate because I don't think it matches the norms now of where we're at.
I don't have a lot of reaction. It's most interesting problems don't have a single answer, right? They involve in much the same way that power structures are intersectional, right? Most of the solutions are going to be intersectional. Intersectionality strengthens systems. Right now, it mainly strengthens a shitty one, right? But you can deploy that, and you can say by being again intentional about who you involve and what you do, you can build things that work. But it's also very hard to solve everything at once. You can't say I'm going to build trust for the world. You can say I'm going to make trust work in this context, and then I'll see what I learn, and then I'll share what I learned, right? Maybe I can make it a joinable system, right? But there's just not a lot of simple answers here, I've been to one consultation with sovereign nations in the U.S. around PMI, the AOU program, and it was really instructional, right? There's not a set of opinions out of sovereign nations. There are hundreds of opinions out of sovereign nations, and they have different desires. And so I would be more interested in saying, how do I let each of you express your norms, right, than saying, how do I build a product that is enough for all of us? That's one product. I think it's going to likely be lots of different ones. In an ideal world, they would use the same ingredients, and they could form networks when they wanted to, right? Because then they can form as the trust forms. The problem, I think, is that we try to build unitary products for an imaginary person, and it gets us where we are.
Mike, I think you have a mic.
Yeah, am I audible? Yeah, right.
Yep.
I kind of want to come back to the question of which comes first, or what's the purpose. Is consent actually a way of getting trust, or is trust necessary for consent?
Mm-hmm.
I'm reminded by my father, who was a lawyer, he used to say, I've got these clients that came to me, and they want me to write a contract because they don't trust someone. And they want to constrain them from acting in ways that they're afraid they would act. He says, I think crazy. The contract presumes trust. Informed consent presumes a trustworthy institution that will act in consistency and compliance with the conditions it offers. And it seems to me that when we ask for consent, we're actually having to assume a kind of trust. And then most people who are in the context where they have to be trusted lack so much power that I'm not sure what other options I have anyway. So what are we really doing with informed consent in relation to trust? And what do we mean by trust?
I mean, how many people have been bamboozled by a piece of paper, right? So I don't think we can assume that trust is built into anything material or digital. And we have to assume, I think we have to assume that trust is not there, unfortunately.
I think that's the case on the health side of data and information. But how many times have you filled out an entry to a sweepstakes or something online where you're giving information away for a very small incentive, a chance to win something? So data that's collected in our society for all of these other reasons, we should trust those folks probably even less, and we don't even think about it. So there's this huge dichotomy in our society in how we think about data. And it was interesting from the IRB analogy here that there is no IRB for marketing companies before they go out and do whatever they want to do. And then they hide all of their little disclaimers in little tiny type that nobody reads either. So we've got sort of two parallel worlds going on right now that's really, really interesting. Kate had a question.
Oh yeah, so we've been talking a lot about trust, which I think is obviously very interesting and important, but I'm also sort of interested in sort of the relative duties that engender those trusts. And especially, John, as you talked to moving from a contract paradigm to a tort liability paradigm, what's really missing is that duty of care, and in particular in the sort of public company, and I don't mean like a public institution, but like a IPO kind of public company who has a fiduciary duty to shareholders versus has what kind of duty to those who contribute, and whether that can ever be reconciled in the private sphere.
I mean, that's exactly the question, right? So I'm married to an attorney, which is one of the reasons I think legally from time to time, and then I'm always wrong, and she corrects me, which is nice, right? It's whenever you propose this, it's such a weird way of thinking of voluntarily entering into extra liability, right, as a way to demonstrate that you have some skin in the game, that it weirds people out at first, right? And so part of the idea is that we're going through and we're voluntarily looking for places where we can introduce transaction cost for being an asshole, right? Because what we've done is we've reduced transaction cost for everything, right, including being an asshole, right? You can be an asshole at scale now, right? It's amazing, right? We elected one, right? But we've lost a lot of the things that implicitly kept people from behaving really badly, right? Because those things were functions of transaction costs that you were unable to scale, right? And so I've just been trying to look through what are all the different ways that we introduce transaction cost before entering into a transaction, right? If I hire someone to come into my house and fix my kitchen, right? If I hire an unbonded contractor, that's my fault, right? But the bond tells me that person, if they screw up, I can sue them and I might get $100,000 back, right, if they disappear and I have to go buy all the materials that they were supposed to buy for me. That's an interesting model to look at. Similarly, what are ways that we can create like a fiduciary duty of care as opposed to a fiduciary duty to the shareholders, right? At a corporate level. So you think of these at every scale, from the individual to the network technology to the business model. How do you introduce transaction costs that trend you towards good behavior, or what we call good behavior, right? And that's where I spend a lot of my time thinking is what can we do that with? And the nice thing about SAGE is that we're a methodological organization, first and foremost, right? We try to invent methods that we think will work better. And so we have space to play around with these kinds of ideas. So, our qualified user program for sharing donated data comes from sitting in line at Global Entry and thinking, what is Global Entry really, right? You get your identity validated. You go through a question test, right? You promise not to bring in cheese or drugs, right? And if you screw up, you never get back in. I'm like, if that lets you get through customs, that ought to let you get into a database, right? But these are transaction costs that violate all the norms of open source or open data, right? And I get critiqued on this all the time. They're like, that's not open source. I'm like, yeah, I know. Open source can be kind of toxic. Right? Google runs entirely on open source software. It's not an open source company, right? And so, but that's the thinking where this all comes from. And that's one of the reasons I try to lay it out is like, let's talk about intentional transaction costs, because releasing them all has had a really weird impact on the ecosystem that has brought us in many ways to the moment.
We have about 3 minutes left, and rather than get us in onto another maybe complex question, I'm just going to put a thought out there that can be discussed while you have a glass of wine in your hand that ties us back to the morning. And our session was about choice, but there were a number of examples provided this morning of when, for the good of the health of our society, social mandate is really where choice is taken away. Immunizations, newborn screening, criminal database, DNA databases or other databases that are seen as really, really important for the good and the health of our society. And where does learning health system and data fit in to that continuum between informed consent for a research project where you yourself are making all of the decisions about whether you participate or not, or all the way the other continuum where the data that is being generated in healthcare is so incredibly important that we need to be utilizing that data in order to improve the system so that you ultimately benefit, but you may have to give up a little bit of choice along the way for that to happen. So why don't we take that after Jody gives her concluding comments, and we can talk more about that around posters and our alcohol. But thank you so much to our panel and for your participation.
fallen off the stage all day, so it's a successful symposium. Thank you. I really am the person between you and a final reception, and it's going to be a really nice happy hour. I said thank you this morning. I need to say it again. Wow, thank you for coming. Thank you for being here. Thank you for a great conversation, and I hope that we get to continue it this afternoon and throughout the year, and again, maybe even next year. There are prizes still to come. So we do have this poster session coming up. We wrote in the call for posters that we would have a prize, and we have 2 prizes. We have one that's a prize for everyone. All of our poster entries have free lifetime registration to this event. And the single winner, because there can be only one, will be announced in an email. The planning committee is going to sort of look and sort of listen to the presentations. We'll make a final determination. We'll let you all know who that is. We'll also send in that email an evaluation, so fill it out. That way we didn't give you a piece of paper to fill out, so hopefully that will work. So I just have a few final comments. It's always a little bit challenging to put together slides before you've actually seen what's going on, but there are pretty pictures, so you can at least enjoy those. And I think that they fit. So I was sort of doodling. I should have been doodling on the tablecloths. I apologize. But that so the first observation is that the ecosystem may not be what we expect. Learning health systems are complex. That there are a lot of differences. Some of those differences are uncomfortable. Some of those differences we value. It's also a very sort of cool space and interesting. There's lots of things going on. There's data that's fluid. There's friction in data. There's friction in ideas. There's friction in the values and technology that are in a learning health system. There's often also sort of a nice sort of multidisciplinary mix of people. If I look around this room, I see data scientists, I see epidemiologists, I see ethicists, I see lawyers, I see sociologists, economists, philosophers. I mean, it's really magnificent. I mean, this is awesome. And Ray talked a little bit about the concept of language and what does learning mean? And to each of us, learning is going to mean something very different. So you talk to an engineer, and learning means not making any mistakes and having a highly efficient system that moves very quickly. To somebody else, learning is all about failure, right? That's a very different way of coming at learning. And it's also learning, we just talked about in the last panel that learning is about listening. And so that's what it's sort of one of my takeaways for today. We also talked a lot about trust, and ecosystems require warranted trust that Lizzie pointed out can halt an entire system. But I think, sort of thinking about this idea of bounded justice, a lack of trust can also lead to devaluing of voices that we don't necessarily agree with, and voices that we're not willing to shift our power structures to really listen to, and that's ultimately something about that it undermines the trust in the system that we clearly know we want to have. The other idea here is that perspective matters, and I just sort of talked about some of that, but we talked about individual perspectives, collectivist notions, groups, individuals, and there are a whole lot of voices that need to be baked into the learning health system. And that really, I think we all sort of, agree that the learning health system model potentially is an opportunity in the way that it's reshaping our conversations to possibly create a system that's better than the one we have now. But that there's a lot of work, that's not an easy thing to do. That's not easy. But we're, a group of very smart people that can maybe do it. So hopefully we'll do this again next year. I'm not going to tell you what a flipped symposium is, but that's sort of the idea that I'm playing around with, and that we're playing around with, and we can talk about it during the poster session, what that means. So definitely stick around. There's posters, there's beverages, and wow, thank you.